In this video, we're going to look at how modulation is configured in Kontakt 5. It's actually quite similar to Native Instruments Massive, but the layout is a little different, so it deserves some attention. I've created a simple Kontakt patch here by dragging a waveform right into a blank rack. That created a new instrument for me, and it actually mapped that single waveform across the keyboard and turned on keyboard tracking. So if I play up and down the keyboard, we will hear that the sound already is modulating, and that we have that really simple modulator, which is the control signal output from the keyboard being routed to sample playback rate. Let's go into the instrument and see how that works. We'll click on this wrench to edit the innards or the details of the instrument. And right now we actually see a source, insert effects, and amplifier section. That's equivalent to the massive oscillator, filter, and amplifier section. So instead of going horizontally from left to right, we're really going vertically from top to bottom, but the segments are really kind of the same. We have a source section, which is creating the sound. In this instance, it's sampler playback instead of an algorithmic generator like Massive has in a synthesis. We have a tracking option right here, which turns on and turns off that control signal from the keyboard to the oscillator playback or sample playback speed. If I turn that off, I play on my keyboard, we get the same note over and over again. If I turn that on, we're going to get the oscillator playback speed or the sample playback speed changing as I play up and down the keyboard. The group insert effects is where we can add filters, and this is equivalent of the filter section in Massive. I can go to add effects, and I could put in, say, a LP4 ladder filter. Maybe turn my cutoff frequency all the way up. And then after that section, we have our amplifier section. Again, at the end of the audio signal path will be your amplifier section. Now we've seen that there's already one modulation configured for us, the keyboard controlling the playback rate of the sample. There is another one already configured for us, and that is an Amplitude Envelope, an envelope controlling the amplitude of our amplifier. And we see that at the bottom of the rack. If you scroll down to the bottom of the rack, you'll find the modulation section. Now Kontakt is a complex device, and in Massive we had 8 pre-configured modulators. We had 4 envelopes and 4 LFOs. In Kontakt, we can create an arbitrary number of LFOs and envelopes, which does add some complexity, and it makes for a little bit of a more complex interface that you have to take a moment to get used to. One of the things that can really help is hiding the portions of the interface you're not using at the moment. It will make it easier to associate your modulation sources at the bottom of the rack and your modulation destinations toward the top of the rack. Another thing that helps with that are these buttons right here. If I click on this, it will jump me from the modulation source up to the modulation destination. And you see that actually opened up the mod section in the amplifier section here. And we see all that important modulation information already laid out for us. We see the modulation source is the envelope, AHDSR in this instance. We see a modulation destination, which is volume, a modulation amount, which is configured with this slider, and the modulation direction is configured with this invert button. With it off, it's a positive modulation, which is what we want for volume. I have a similar button to jump me down to the modulation source, and we see a pretty typical amplitude envelope. We do have attack, decay, sustain, release, but this envelope also added a hold parameter, which controls how much time the envelope stays at the top of its level before entering the decay phase, and we also have the ability to change the curvature of the interpolation in that attack phase. So that is the modulation that's already configured for us, and you'll see that modulation, or these mod sections, are all over the Kontakt interface. If I go up to the source section, we actually see that pitch bend is already set up to modulate pitch, and it's doing so over 2 semitones. I also see that velocity is already configured to modulate volume, and that's going to be over around 40%. But how do we add our own modulators? Well, in Massive, we set up a simple vibrato, and we can do that here in a similar way. Instead of a drag and drop, we have to actually create the modulation source. And we do that by first going to a modulation destination, say tuning, and right-clicking. And then we get a list of all the possible modulation sources. And we're trying to create a vibrato, so I'll go to LFOs and choose a sine function to control our playback speed, to give us some vibrato. Immediately, we have the modulation lane. We have a modulation source, which is LFO sine, a destination which is pitch, and we can control a modulation amount. And I'll turn that way up so we really hear it. Again, I can click on this button to jump down to the modulation source, and all the information about that LFO will be listed at the bottom. So you see with this system, I can create as many LFOs and envelopes as I want, and if I play a key now, we get a crazy vibrato, right? And I can control its parameters here, right? And if I want to change the amount of vibrato, I would go to the top and adjust the amount here. Now, if you want to create synchronized LFOs, you go to the Hertz parameter right here and click and hold, and you'll be able to adjust your LFO rate in metric units. So you're synchronizing the LFO to your global tempo, which is very, very handy. So that's how we configure modulation in Kontakt. It actually is very similar to how we configure modulation in every synthesizer, and the important thing is you need to have a modulation source, which this case was LFO, a modulation destination, in this case was pitch, a modulation amount, which we adjust with the fader, and a modulation direction, which we control with the invert button right there.